Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really awesome guest involved in creating a better tomorrow for all of us. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Majid Fotuhi, who is the medical director of NeuroGrow Brain Fitness Center, a neurology practice which is dedicated to treating patients with a wide range of CNS pathologies, including concussion, memory loss, attention deficit disorder. He is also an affiliate staff at Johns Hopkins Medicine and teaches medical students at Harvard Medical School, and has been an active member of the American Academy of Neurology, American Medical Association, International Brain Research Organization, and Society for Neuroscience. Dr. Fatui received his medical degree cum laude from Harvard Medical School and is a member of the Harvard MIT Division of Health Sciences and Technology, did his doctoral Ph.D. degree in neuroscience from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, and his initial clinical research at Hopkins focused on basic brain neurochemistry and finding very effective ways to prevent dementia. His current research focuses on designing really interesting multidisciplinary treatment for patients with not just memory loss, but post-concussive syndrome. He has published research findings in every major peer-reviewed journal, from Brain Research, the Journal of Neuroscience, Lancet, Nature, Neurology, just to name a few. In addition to all those publications, is broadly published multiple books, including The Memory Cure, How to Protect Your Brain Against Memory Loss and Alzheimer's Disease, the New York Times Puzzles to Keep Your Brain Young, and his most recent book, Boost Your Brain, teaches people ultimately how to grow the size of their hippocampus, a really very important topic. And then no doubt, if any of you watch TV, you have seen Dr. Fatui on multiple media outlets over the years talking about these topics. We're honored to have him with us today. Dr. Majid Fotuhi, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today. Great honor having you.
Yes, it's my pleasure to be talking with you, and thanks for that nice introduction.
It's great having you. It's been a really amazing journey you've been on. I would love to start off sort of at the beginning, because I took a look back sort of the early days, the early 90s, where you're doing your PhD on this really interesting area of these metabotropic glutamate receptors, which sort of at the intersection of a lot of the things that we'll be getting into in terms of neuroplasticity and neurotoxicity and their sort of widespread involvement in every neurologic and psychiatric disorder out there. Take us back to the early 90s. What got you interested originally in focusing on this really fascinating area of biology?
Well, thanks for looking into those things and digging out that old research I used to do. I'm fascinated about how our brain makes us who we are, and how these simple molecules can make a huge difference on whether a person is hyper or calm, a person that gets dementia or doesn't. And it's amazing to me that simple changes on a three-dimensional structure of one molecule can have some profound impact on people's lives. So in 1990s, when I was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins, I looked into metabotropic glutamate receptors and how they were affecting different part of hippocampus, which is the part of brain for memory and learning. And I realized that these receptors had different distributions, which explained why certain parts of hippocampus were so vulnerable to things like hypoxia. And it made sense because people who smoke, people who have risk factors are more likely to have memory problems because of these molecular changes and the way these receptors are set up in the memory part of the brain. And then from there on, I became interested in other aspects of things that affect the hippocampus. And I realized that, obesity can shrink the hippocampus. And stress, increases cortisol levels, and cortisol can shrink the hippocampus. Then I said, wait a minute, people who have Alzheimer's disease have much smaller hippocampus than other people, but their lifestyle choices may have impacted the size of their hippocampus. So should we be calling them as having Alzheimer's disease? Hippocampus is about the size of your thumb. You have one on the left, one on the right. And this is ground zero for learning and memory. And this part of brain is very unique in that it has a high degree of malleability. It shrinks easily, it grows easily. So, when I published my book, Memory Cure, in 2002, I looked into all the things that shrink the hippocampus: hypertension, obesity, insomnia, sleep apnea, too much stress, sedentary lifestyle. All of them can shrink the hippocampus gradually over decades. So when an 80-year-old can't remember where they put their car, or they are confused when they go to a new environment, or they get lost driving home, it's not that they have Alzheimer's disease. It's that these medical conditions over time had chipped away on hippocampus, which then resulted in the confusion, and they shouldn't be really called as having Alzheimer's disease. So that was interesting. And then, I met Will Shortz, who's the crossword puzzle editor for New York Times, and we're talking about how to make these concepts interesting for average person. So we made a book of crossword puzzles, and many of them had to do with like which part of brain is important for memory, hippocampus. How do the cells connect with each other through synapse? So it was actually a fun thing to work with Will Shortz, who's been the crossword puzzle editor for NPR and New York Times for more than 20 or 30 years. And then the research in 2000 and 2002, 2005 showed that many things can reverse the shrinkage in the hippocampus. And that was really exciting to me. It turns out exercise grows the hippocampus, meditation can grow the hippocampus, treating sleep apnea grows the hippocampus. And that was like a wow moment for me. I said, oh my God. So if you had bad lifestyle choices over decades, you're not doomed. You can reverse the process. And actually, I published 2 articles in Nature Reviews Neurology just about that. All the factors that can grow back your hippocampus. And you can grow your hippocampus even if there was no significant shrinkage to begin with. So let's say you want to have a bigger hippocampus so that when you get to your 80s, you have more material, you have more memory responsible tissue in your brain, so you're more resilient to the effects of hippocampus. You can vaccinate your brain against the hippocampus by doing things that grows it. The bigger the hippocampus, likely you are to get Alzheimer's disease. So these were fascinating to me, and I wrote the other book they just mentioned, Boost Your Brain. And now I also teach at George Washington University about those factors, about the fact that exercise, sleeping well, treating sleep apnea, meditation, all of these factors can literally grow the hippocampus and make you more resilient to the effects of aging and reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about, because I didn't mention in the intro, you were involved early on, as you were mentioning, in these longitudinal studies, looking at things like vitamins and natural supplements, NSAIDs, fish oils, and so forth. And I sit here and I think, I guess sort of the medical world has taught us a lot. I've had hypertension since I was in my late 20s, and I know I shouldn't probably eat a lot of salt, and I got to limit saturated fats and so forth. And I know for my liver, I probably shouldn't eat a lot of sugar and keep my HbA1c a certain level. what were some of, we'll get into, the broader brain fitness program in a little bit that you've been developing in terms of some of these combinatorial approaches, but what are some of sort of the basic things that you learned from back in those studies as far as just what is basic brain fitness, brain resilience that we should be thinking about on a daily basis, just like when we take care of our heart or what it may be? What are some of the basic things that came to the top of those studies in your during the time you spent with them?
Yeah. So in 2002 to 2005, 2006, I participated in a research program at Johns Hopkins to look into on the effects of vitamins on brain function and risk of Alzheimer's disease. We think that a lot of risk factors for brain decay have to do with inflammation. Mm-hmm. So we were one people who on average take anti-inflammatory medications such as NSAIDs or things like vitamin E, which reduce inflammation in the brain, have a lower risk of developing Alzheimer's or memory loss late in life. And this study is a population study of Cache County in Utah, which is a small town where people usually have long life expectancies. And it was so interesting that we found that people who had taken omega-3 fatty acids, mm-hmm. and people who had taken NSAIDs, for example, ibuprofen for arthritis, and people taking vitamin E just as a supplement, had better memory functions when they were tested along the way and then 10 or 12 years later. And it was a clear-cut difference between people who were taking these vitamins and NSAIDs and people who were not taking it. And it really reinforced the importance of inflammation on the things that can affect the brain. Mm-hmm. And our Mediterranean diet, which is low inflammatory kind of diet, is beneficial. Mm-hmm. People who eat a Mediterranean diet have anywhere between 40 to 60% lower chance of developing Alzheimer's. So this was what we found back in 2003, 2004, and we published in several articles. And that's when I thought, well, I know that exercise is good and taking this vitamin is good and sleep is good. Do you really need to wait 10 or 12 years to see results? Mm-hmm. Could you see results, let's say, 3 months? And that gave me the idea of developing a multidisciplinary program that combines all the good things in a sort of condensed version. And that's when we saw that actually patients had remarkable improvement in their memory, attention, concentration within a matter of 3 months. And then we had people who had gone on an MRI at the beginning of the program and at the end of the program. And we saw that they actually had an increase in the volume of their hippocampus, about 3%, mm-hmm. equivalent of being having a brain that's 6 years younger. Hippocampus shrinks on average, but about 0.5% per year in your 50s and 60s. So if somebody's hippocampus grows by 3%, it's like their brain, their hippocampus is 6 years younger in a matter of 3 months. Mm. And that was fascinating to me. And we published that in the Journal of Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease. Yep. So the concept that things that increase inflammation are bad for the brain, and things that increase blood flow and reduce inflammation are good for the brain, mm-hmm. are now clear cut. They're not conversations and hypotheses and maybe yes, maybe not. They're confirmed beyond any doubt that these things are really good for your brain, and these things really do increase your brain reserve. Your brain mm-hmm. reserve is how much brain you have throughout your life. The more brain and the more hippocampus you have, you're more resilient against the effects of Alzheimer's disease. It's like a mm-hmm. retirement fund brain. Right. So increase this retirement fund at any age. You can start in your 20s, 30s, 40s. The sooner you start, the better. But at any time is better than not starting it.
Yeah, I think this is an extremely important point as we'll be getting into the brain program. But, you know, as you were just mentioning prior, and Dr. Fatui has three really important articles, and just I mentioned them here. One, factors association with resistance to dementia despite high Alzheimer's disease pathology. That was 2009 in Neurology. Then there's changing perspectives regarding late life dementia and the challenge and public health implications of Alzheimer's overdiagnosis. And I think these are three very important papers that you wrote, because they bring together, as you were saying, this concept of mental frailty, of mental resilience, that obviously in my 80 and 90-year-old mother and father-in-law over here is not just some beta amyloid, right? I mean, there's tangles, there's Lewy bodies, there's cerebrovascular damage, there's white matter changes, there's all this stuff. And I think this is an extremely important piece as we get into the finished programs that, as you point out, should we be classifying all these things as they're separate, or as you were saying, this combination condition that all ultimately focuses on the shrinking of what we got inside the cell. Say a few words about these particular papers. I think this is an extremely important point as we'll be getting into the brain fitness program.
Well, I tell you, I'm so impressed by the fact that you've read so many of the things I've written, and you're so knowledgeable in this field. Thanks for taking your time to do that. And so, yeah, I think that we should not be calling grandma who is confused and has memory loss as having Alzheimer's disease, because, you know, many things have contributed over decades to the shrinkage in her brain. And to label her as having Alzheimer's disease suggests that she just woke up one day and she was hit by a disease.
Right.
Now, there are diseases in the brain like Parkinson's disease. Now, Parkinson's disease is a disease that affects the parts of the brain for control of your movements. You become slow, your speaking is slow, you drool, you're walking slow. No, that's a disease. You know, although several studies have shown exercise lower your risk of getting Parkinson's disease, and it can actually slow the progression, but overall it's a disease. Or frontotemporal dementia is a disease. But what we call Alzheimer's disease is really not a disease. It's a soup of problems that happen to the brains of elderly. Now, there's an early onset Alzheimer's disease that happens to people in their 50s and 60s, and that is a disease. That is a because out of nowhere, a person who's working and has life of, you know, a spouse and children, suddenly, over a matter of months or a couple of years, experience a shrinkage in his hippocampus or her hippocampus and cannot function. That is a disease. That's called early onset disease, early onset Alzheimer's disease. But when people have confusion and memory problems in their 80s, that condition is not the same as early onset Alzheimer's disease. And that's an extremely point. Just because they both have shrinkage in the hippocampus, it does not mean that they're the same. And that's the billion-dollar point, that they're both have shrinkage in the hippocampus for different reasons. I mean, if you put a bullet in someone's head and the hippocampus goes away, you can't say they have Alzheimer's disease. The hippocampus is gone, but Alzheimer's disease. For example, boxers, or football players who have had thousands of concussions have much smaller hippocampus than people who don't have frequent concussions. Now, it's fair to call them as having Alzheimer's disease, because to say they have Alzheimer's disease means like they were fine and suddenly something happened and now they can't think straight. And I think that we need to reconsider the label of Alzheimer's disease for people, and we should just call it cognitive impairment. We should say mild cognitive impairment, moderate cognitive impairment, or severe cognitive impairment, because we don't know what's the cause. And I tell you, as someone who's seen thousands of patients who have lost their memory and they're confused in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, you know, calling a 94-year-old who's confused having Alzheimer's disease is absolutely wrong.
Right.
Because, you know, over time, the wear and tear in the brain eventually causes shrinkage in the hippocampus. So you can delay the age at which these things happen, but eventually they will happen. If you live to 110, a 110-year-old will not be able to read and write and type and remember things the same way as a 70-year-old would. But they don't have a disease. It's just that, at some the wear and tear adds up. Absolutely. So these are important concepts for public health issues, because when you tell someone they have disease, like Alzheimer's disease, basically you're telling them you're going to have a miserable death. You're going to go down the drain, and you're going to be confused, and you're not going to recognize your family members, and there's nothing we can do for you, and you're going to die in a miserable way, which I think is cruel to tell someone like that. Because number one, I know that the majority of them did not have a disease like that. Things added up over decades. And the second thing is that a lot of those things can be modified.
Right.
We did a study, and I'll tell you more details later, and we showed that 84% of people in their 60s and 70s had actually improved their memory. And these are people with mild cognitive impairment, which is a stage between normal and what we call Alzheimer's disease. Mm-hmm. So I think we should reserve the label of Alzheimer's disease only for people who get it in their 50s and 60s, and not for people in their 70s and 80s.
Got it. Very important. I appreciate you laying the groundwork on that one. So now that's a beautiful segue to your most recent paper in June of this year, Journal of Alzheimer's Disease Reports, benefits 12-week non-drug brain fitness program for patients with ADHD, post-concussion syndrome, and memory loss, and again, bringing these together under sort of this unified umbrella. 223 so adults and children obviously involved here. Talk a little bit about this, what you learned, and again, any unique components of a study of this nature that involves not just multiple pathologies with this unifying core, but also, different ages, because we'll get into aging in a little bit, but obviously a rather broad spectrum of patient types here as well. Take us into this, if you would.
Yeah. So in 2006, we published about the findings of our study of elderly who had completed our 12-week program. Mm-hmm. So the program together incorporated all these concepts I just talked about. Yep. We did an assessment to establish the degree of problems. Did these patients have, from 1 to 10, 2 out of 10 memory problems, or 9 out of 10 memory problems? And we also looked at their sleep. Do they have sleep apnea? Do they have insomnia? And how bad it is. We looked at their diets. Are they eating, a healthy diet, or are they just eating hamburgers and French fries every day? We looked at the stress level. Are they just getting stressed over every minor thing? Or in general, they're calm and they get stressed when there's a real problem, like there's a fire or they're getting fired or something. And then we put all those things into these diagrams we call spidograms, so that when I looked at these spidograms, which had 1 to 10 for each of those 50 things that I just talked to you about, I could see at a glance whether all the points are at the top, at the rim, like 10 out of 10 memory problems, 10 out of 10 anxiety, 10 out of 10 irritability, 10 out of 10 headaches, 10 out of 10 fatigue, 10 out of 10 poor diet. So this would give me at a glance how bad things are for an individual person. There were people who had, low, what I call brain symptoms load, and there are people who had high brain symptoms load. Mm-hmm. And that was a very useful piece of information for me at the beginning of this program. Sure. Then, we provided 3 sets of treatments for them. We provided them with coaching for lifestyle modifications. Mm-hmm. We would see what things gone wrong. Like, was it a diet? Was it that they slept 3 hours a night? Was it that they were snoring and they had never had any tests for sleep apnea? And then, whether exercising, not exercising. And then the first component was lifestyle coaching, to tell them to improve the things that are not good for them. Because some people exercise but did not sleep well. Some people slept well but didn't exercise. So we worked on the things that mattered and were important for them. The second thing was brain training. we did a cognitive testing, and we established whether they had, compared to people their age, more memory problems, more attention problems, more processing speed problems. Some people are slow to think and solve problems. Some people are fast. And we look for executive function, how good they are with their mental agility to be able to manipulate information in their head. And so with brain training, we provided them with cognitive training in the areas that we're not so good at. Some people were very good at, for example, memory, but their attention scores were low. So then we played chess with them, or we had brain games that required sustained attention. We work on the attention part of the brain versus memory part of the brain. That was the second intervention. And then we provide them with a form of biofeedback called neurofeedback. And this was a way of improving their brain waves so that become calm and focused. So they came to the program to our office twice a week. And they had 45 minutes of brain coaching to discuss those things and get coaching, and then 45 minutes of neurofeedback. And this 90 minutes twice a week continued for 6 weeks. They would repeat their tests so we can see how much progress they made. Some things had worked better than other things, and then we tweaked things for the second part, and they would come back after 6 weeks, and then we looked at their brain functions again. And this program called Brain Fitness Program. So in 2005, 2006, we provided this program for older people, 60s and 70s, who had mild cognitive impairment, which, as I said, a condition between normal and Alzheimer's disease. And we saw 84% of them had significant improvements in the cognitive functions, 84%. Now, these are people, some of whom were told they had Alzheimer's disease, and 84% of them improved. I mean, this was remarkable. And this was not just them telling us they feel better. 84% of people had improved their objective cognitive testing results. In other words, these cognitive tests, which are computer-based, are independent of people who provided the training for them. And they're provided by a third party who did not know who was who. It was just a computer-based cognitive testing that was provided for patients, independent of the staff who provided the training for them. It's not like they were nice and gave them better scores. I was so impressed myself, especially when we did MRIs and we saw that the brain had grown. I mean, if it was a drug, if we had give these people a drug that showed 80% improvement in objective testing, and about half of them had 3% on average growth in the hippocampus, imagine how much that drug would have received publicity around the world. Just imagine that. However, not the one drug. It requires effort on the part of the patients to show up, or for family members to bring the patient to our clinic. And, it did not get huge publicity, although it was mentioned in Time magazine. So then I thought, well, we are providing brain rehabilitation for our patients, and we are rejuvenating the brain. What if we provided this for patients who have had persistent concussion symptoms? Some patients who have concussion get better. About 15 to 25% of patients with concussion have persistent symptoms for months after their concussion. Usually people get better in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maximum 12 weeks. But after 90 days, it's called persistent post-concussive syndrome. And so we provide this program for those patients, and we saw similar results. About 80% of patients had improvements in their test results. 100% of patients are better. Like, everybody who came felt better at the end. There was nobody who went the program and said, this was useless. Nobody. Because, think of it. We improve people's sleep, we improve people's diet, we help them how to manage stress. I mean, it's a no-brainer. People get better. It's just that we provided it in a comprehensive setup. We just didn't focus on, we just didn't say, okay, meditate. Or we didn't just focus on exercise. Or we just didn't, focus on cognitive training. And I think that's a huge secret to our success. We provided a multidisciplinary program that showed that address all of a person's symptoms, not just the memory symptoms, because the memory symptoms and anxiety symptoms and insomnia are related. Each one worsens the other one. You don't have, you're anxious, you don't sleep well, your memory is not good, you don't perform better, you get more anxious, you're more stressed, your sleep is worse. So it's a vicious cycle. And we address all of them. I trained the brain coaches myself based on my books and publications. They had to read those things and pass an exam. So they were all enthusiastic brain coaches because they had seen the kind of results that we discussed. And so when they talked with the patients, they were really into their patients because they knew these patients would get better. And many of them had seen how somebody came like tired, hopeless, they're just waiting to get Alzheimer's and they die. And then 3 months later, they come from the gym, they have signed up for a Bible study, or they're doing volunteer work in the church or synagogue, or they're like new people in 3 months. Mm-hmm. And so the brain coaches who have seen those things, they themselves were excited and enthusiastic for the next round of patients. Anyway, we provide this program for patients with concussion. Great. We published it in Journal of Rehabilitation, and it was great. Then, and we published that in 2020. I'm a neurologist, and we had patients who come, and some patients came with ADHD, and I looked into that, and I realized that a lot of people who get labeled as having ADHD also have multiple causes for their attention problems, sleep being a major one. If a child or a teenager doesn't get enough sleep, they're groggy, and sometimes they become hyper the next day, and they get labeled as having ADHD, but in fact, they have poor sleep. And we provided a similar program for kids or adults with attention deficit disorder, and we saw that they too improved. And it kind of retrospect made sense. We improved the biology of the brain. And when your brain gets more oxygen, when there's less inflammation in the brain, your brain is happier, and a happier, healthier brain functions better. And we put labels on people as having ADHD or having memory loss or having persistent concussion symptoms, but all of them originate from the brain that's not optimal, that's not perfectly healthy. And so when you make your brain healthy, it functions better. And when it functions better, you feel better, you sleep better, you're less anxious, you remember better, you have better attention. It's kind of such an intuitive sense when you think of it that way. Yeah. And so the publication that we had 3 months ago showed just that 3 groups of patients received a same structured 12-week program, and all 3 of them showed about 80% improvement in their cognitive test results. And again, it's rare for someone not to say, hey, I feel better, because even when you improved someone's sleep alone, they feel better. Mm-hmm. And again, the other secret to our success was, when patients go to a doctor, let's say for a sleep problem, the doctor prescribes the medications or makes some recommendations and say, okay, I'll see you in 6 weeks or 2 months or something, and that's it. We took ownership of their problem. The patient's sleep problems became our problem. It was not like it's your problem, it was our problem. Mm-hmm. And then we will say, try this. And for example, put your phone away. Don't take any caffeinated beverages in the afternoon. Make sure your room is dark and quiet. A lot of patients have pets, and the pet doesn't make them prevents them from sleeping because the pet keeps waking them up. I said, listen, figure that out. I know you love your pet, but figure it out. Your sleep is important, and you can't let your pet, your dog, ruin your sleep and ruin your quality of life. Right. Figure it out. And we will give suggestions, maybe, put them in a different room or figure something. We will get really into their lives to figure out what it is. People had arguments with their spouses because they don't get along. Well, that may be the root of the problem, because if they're fighting all the time, they're not sleeping. If they're not sleeping, they're not functioning at work. And if they're not functioning well at work, they're more stressed, and more stressed, they're more likely to get arguments. And so, we're not social workers, we're not therapists. However, we'll do some common sense interventions, like be nice to your spouse, buy her some flowers, or, or see a marriage counselor.
Right.
Because, a lot of times it's those little things that made a difference. Like, grandma who was not remembering things. And we said, well, it turns out that grandma never sees grandchildren. Why don't you just have FaceTime, regular FaceTime with grandmother for grandchildren, and pay the grandchildren. Give them $2 every time they talk with grandma. And that simple intervention made grandma happier. When she was happier, she would go for walks. If she was for a walk, she was better company and didn't complain as much. And so, this is what we did. We really got into the nitty-gritties of our patients and found out why is it they didn't sleep? Why isn't they were stressed? Why wasn't they feeling good? And we did this in a comprehensive way. We were not therapists, and we did have social workers in our team, but we did not try to set a therapy session for our patients. It was more of a very active, we have 12 weeks to get you better. It's not like come once a week for 2 years. No, this was an intensive, comprehensive fitness program, brain fitness program, and we wanted to see results in 12 weeks. This was not a 6-month project or 2-year project. So it was very fast-paced, and patients loved it because they really appreciated somebody is in their journey with them. Our brain coaches didn't tell patients, do this and come back. Like, for example, we didn't just say exercise 45 minutes 3 times a week, come back in 6 weeks. We would say, what do you like? Do you like swimming, walking, rowing? And they say, oh, we like walking, but we don't have time. So, well, let's figure it out. What if you have to take care of your mother? What if you took your mother for a walk? Or what if, you walk from certain place to certain place? What if, you say you don't get along with your husband? What if you guys went for a walk together? That way you talk and you walk. Yep. We tried to take ownership of their problem as our problem. We didn't blame them for not doing what we told them. We took it upon ourselves. Why is it that we have not been successful enough? And if, intervention A didn't work, we work on intervention B. Let's say we did those things and sleep didn't work. Then I would say, like, how about Benadryl? How about some melatonin? And how about, I really stayed away from prescribing medications for our patients. But if it was really like a person hasn't slept well for a long time, as much as I hate medications for sleep, I would give them, say, okay, listen, I'll give you something for 2 weeks, just so that your body gets into the rhythm of falling asleep. Right. You haven't slept in so long, your body has forgotten how to sleep. Like, you need to get down to these things. Yeah, so, these things made a huge difference, and it required a lot of my time because I was on every patient. We had a boutique practice. We didn't have, hundreds of patients every day. We had like 7-8 patients a day. I knew all my patients, and our brain coaches knew all our patients. And I think, it was a huge time investment on our part, but I felt that we changed the trajectory of our patients. A patient who had concussion symptoms for 2 years and had lost her job and was getting divorced, and, things were falling apart, felt better. Her marriage came back to work again, and she got a new job, and she was better for the rest of her life. And, some grandpa and grandfather was home alone, and it was told that he is at early stage of Alzheimer's disease, and family would, just were waiting for him to get worse, have a new life. Would be walking more, would be going to church or synagogue more. They would do more things. And, they were happier for the rest of their lives. We changed people's lives trajectory. And I really enjoy doing that.
Yeah, it's an extremely I enjoy sort of the multidisciplinary, the combinatorial, as I say, approaches. How how you've taken this. It's extremely elegant. And then coming back to sort of the you've talked as we had this discussion about this interesting balance of controlling neurotoxicity, keeping inflammation low, increasing neurogenesis, all this really interesting neurobiology that is going on or is resulting as a result of these interventions. In a world where a lot of people unfortunately want sort of these single magic bullets still, and I can just speak from the perspective of watching the sort of the amyloid beta therapeutic fiasco over the last couple of decades, where it seems like our pharmaceutical intervention approaches have been exactly the opposite of what you're finding out, right? They cause inflammation and all sorts of other problems when you put these antibodies in nowadays. And I'm not exactly sure where sort of the pharmacotherapeutic armamentarium is headed. But I'd love to get your perspective on where you think some of this stuff should be going, because it's clearly, you've definitely found something that works, not just in one condition, but sort of this family of disorders. What would you like to see happen in terms of, specifically as we focus more on, it's Alzheimer's month now in September, in terms of preventative interventions, how can this grow? How can this get bigger, and also affect sort of the types of products and services that we see out there for these conditions, especially in the older populations of folks?
So let me give some background for your listeners about these concepts and what amyloid is, and what's the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and what pharmaceutical companies have been doing. Mm-hmm. See, when you look at early onset Alzheimer's disease, and you look at the brain, you see accumulation of what's called amyloid. Amyloid is a collection of protein which they become condensed and insoluble. They become like a piece of gum in your brain. And that attracts a lot of inflammation. And when these like little pieces of pebbles or pieces of gum accumulate in the brain, those parts of the brains don't work. And it usually starts in the temporal lobe and the hippocampus and moves on to other brain and causes confusion, difficulty going to familiar places, forgetting names of family members, and so on. And there's another protein called tau, which is similar in that it accumulates into insoluble pieces of gum inside neurons. The amyloid is between neurons. It starts in synapses, and tau starts inside neurons, in the axons, the lengthy tails of brain cells. Now, in Alzheimer's disease, early onset Alzheimer's disease, these things happen quickly, and they travel so interesting from the memory parts of the brain to the frontal lobes, and they cause first memory problems and then executive function problems. That's a disease. Mm-hmm. Now, what happens with a lot of other things in people in their 80s and 90s is that when you don't have enough blood flow, when there is atherosclerosis, or what used to be called hardening the arteries, mm-hmm. this part of the brain doesn't work either. And then when you have things like concussion, those hits to the brain increase levels of amyloid and tau in the brain. And when you don't have enough sleep, you increase the level of amyloid in the brain. The amyloid builds up the more you don't sleep. So if you have only 4 hours of sleep for 20 years versus 4 hours sleep for 2 months, your brain is a lot smaller. Your hippocampus is much smaller for 20 years of insomnia versus 2 months or 2 years of insomnia. So these other things contribute to formation of amyloid. But these other things also contribute to the narrowing of the arteries, because the arteries are usually flexible, become like pipes. They become rigid. Mm-hmm. And what I find really fascinating about how the brain works is that when your heart pumps, There's a pulsation in the blood vessels, in your carotid, you can feel it. Goes to the brain, those small capillaries, which are as thin as a hair, also pulsate. That pulsation of the blood vessels pushes a clearing of the fluid from the arteries into the veins. So your brain is constantly getting rinsed. And this process happens a lot more during sleep than happens when you're awake. I don't know why, but it is about 60 to 70% of this clearing of the fluid of cleansing of the brain. Because when brain cells are active, they create metabolites, byproducts of these metabolic activities. It's like junk that builds up. It's the garbage that needs to be cleared. And so with every pulse, you get pushing of the fluid that rinses the brain. It's a beautiful system that was discovered recently. So one that gets cleared is amyloid. And so, it happens at night, mostly than during the day. And so much of this fluid gets cleared at night. Now, when you don't get enough sleep, this amyloid builds up because if it's not cleared, it's like in the garbage collection in New York that happens every night. Let's say it happened 30%. Imagine how much garbage accumulates over time in the city of New York. And that's bad. And same thing in the brain. These byproducts add up. And it's not just amyloid, there are other things too, like iron may be built up and other things build up. So when you are in your 80s and you've had poor sleep and you had high blood pressure and you had diabetes and you have had many concussions, then just think of the mess that there is in the brain, one of which is too much amyloid. Now, I give credit to pharmaceutical companies for having spent billions of dollars trying to clear the amyloid. It was first discovered in 1999, where they were doing clinical trials for anti-amyloid drugs, and it worked. The brains of people became clear of amyloid when these medications were given, but the patients didn't become normal, which meant that amyloid was not the full story. It was part of the story, was not the full story. And a lot of patients died. So then pharmaceutical companies say, well, we're almost there. Let's try different drugs. And they tried at least 100 drugs. And I give them credit for patience, for persistence, for investment in these things they did. But study after study after study failed to show meaningful results until, and as of 2 years ago, they were just going to forget that. And there were more talk about, let's think of new venues, new things. And then one study showed a little bit of improvement, a little bit of less decline in a subgroup of patients. And they said, well, let's build that into a big deal. And they did. So then in recent study that was presented at the American Alzheimer's Association in Stockholm, and I was actually there, they showed that anti-amyloid drugs were able to reduce the rate of decline in people who had Alzheimer's disease. And one thing they did is that they took people who had a lot of amyloid in their brain to begin with, and they saw that there was a reduction in the load of amyloid. Actually, the full brain amyloid was resolved. I mean, the brain was cleared of amyloid. You could, before and after, no amyloid. And then there was some reduction in the severity of the dementia cognitive symptoms. And this was not from patients, it's mostly from caregivers telling, yes, my mother is less confused. However, you would think that if 100% of amyloid is cleared, why is it they're like 10 or 20% less worse? If amyloid was a full story, why they're only 10, 20% less worse? Nobody got better. Nobody said, oh, my memory is gone. The degree of improvement was not, wow. The degree of improvement, yeah, she's less confused. She's still confused, less confused, which is different than what we had. when we did our program, the patients actually had an improvement in the cognitive score. Not that they declined less. They actually, instead of going like this, they went like that. And the recent study shows that this, they've gone like this. So there's a huge problem with these drugs is that they're expensive, anywhere, 30,000, 20,000, 40,000 a year, just the medications. And they're expensive because these patients need frequent MRIs, 16%. It's a significant number of them develops huge inflammation in the brain. And studies show that all the clinical trials for anti-amyloid drugs shrink the brain, which is concerning.
Yep.
And somehow that piece of information is not talked about. So they're expensive, they're cumbersome. You have to take grandma to these centers and you have to infuse them with these medications. And I think they're not easy to use and they're expensive and they have subtle improvements. I would definitely not let my parents have it, because for the grandma to be a little less confused and spend $100,000 a year, that's not a good deal, especially since grandma doesn't feel anywhere different.
Right.
I think amyloid is part of the story. The amyloid, clearing the amyloid doesn't increase blood flow in the brain. See, that's the thing. When people have hardening the arteries, giving people anti-amyloid medication is not going to help.
Right.
It's not going to help. It's, the one thing I like about what I've done over the past 30 years is that I've read this stuff so much. I really have a deep understanding of what's going on inside the brain. Mm-hmm. And as I explained, there's the blood flow issue, there's a clearing of chemicals issue, and there's amyloid issue. So amyloid is part of the story, but it's not the full story. Yep. And that perfect makes sense that if you just take the amyloid away, but you have not addressed the sleep issues and the gunk that's accumulated over the brain and the hardening the arteries and the blood flow in the brain, you only see partial results, which is what has happened. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we are. And I think that unfortunately, despite the billions of dollars this pharmaceutical have spent, they're on the wrong track. And they are on the wrong track. They really need to combine the kind of things I do, yep, with anti-amyloid. And then at some point, the amyloid medications should be like, supplements. You shouldn't take something so toxic, so expensive, so dangerous to see this much results. You should be given that's readily available, easy to administer, and cheap.
Yep, absolutely. Spot on. Dr. Fatui, one last thing while we have you, and I so appreciate your time today, but I just wanted to stop one other place on a very, very pertinent and related topic. At the end of 2020, you wrote a really interesting paper on the neurobiology of COVID-19 with your colleagues at Washington University, UCLA, and in a very similar manner with what you were just saying in terms of cytokine storm and coagulation and blood flow and all these things that we see now as sequelae. You propose this interesting Neuro-COVID classification scheme, again looking at sort of everything that's happening here as it relates to, once again, a suite of neurological and psychiatric disorders. Say a few words about this paper, if you would, and a little bit of what you're doing in this particular space.
Yeah, so when COVID happened and I was at home, I actually started looking into the literature as to what exactly happens when this virus enters your body. And we need to keep in mind that this is not the first time that a similar virus has affected the brain and our body. So what I learned is that much of what happens with COVID that causes problems is with coagulation, hypercoagulability, and formation of small blood clots. It's like a storm of blood clots that travels throughout the body. It's virus. The virus triggers, it affects an enzyme called ACE. And when that's affected, the coagulation pathway is affected, and then you get formation of these small, tiny blood clots, and then those blood clots travel throughout the body. They go to the kidney, they go to the heart, they go to the skin, they go to the brain. And we found out that the symptoms that happens in the brain has to do mostly with the various degree of coagulation problems in the brain. Only a little bit of virus going inside the brain, and a virus causing the damage in the brain itself. It was a secondary issues triggered by the virus they were causing these problems. And we felt, okay, so if you reduce the coagulation with things like aspirin or anticoagulation, it should work. And in fact, anticoagulation did become a standard treatment for people who went to the hospital with COVID symptoms, and it did see good results. And it was really exciting to me because we predicted that, and later on, as we watched what happened, it did work.
Yep.
And did become a standard treatment. Of course, the vaccines were incredible. I wish we had a vaccine for what causes us, light cognitive impairment. I think the best vaccine for late life cognitive impairment, and you shouldn't call it Alzheimer's disease, is exercise, diet, sleep, stress reduction. Those 4 things are the pillars of prevention of late life cognitive impairment. And I think if we, pharmaceutical companies, and I think general public would like to have a quick remedy. They would like to want something, just take a pill and then your symptoms go away. We are accustomed to want to have that miracle drug that will just take care of everything. You just take a pill and it goes away. And those things have happened for HIV. In 1980s, I remember I was a medical student at Harvard. 1990s, patients with HIV would die, and there was so much news about the miserable death experience. And then these days, people with HIV walk around, they take the simple pills, and they have an almost normal life.
Yep.
And it worked. It worked. However, the late life cognitive impairment is not one thing.
Right.
And that is what to know. That's what policyholders need to know. That's what the medical societies need to appreciate. The late life cognitive impairment is due to a soup of problems: lack of sleep, lack of exercise, too much stress, too much inflammation, poor diet. All those things chip away on the brain through different mechanisms.
Right.
Poor diet causes inflammation. A lack of sleep can increase your sympathetic nervous system, increase cortisol, and high cortisol is toxic to the hippocampus and shrinks the hippocampus, and you have problems. Sleep apnea is lack of oxygen. Not exercising is lack of oxygen. When you exercise, you increase the number of mitochondria in your cells, in your muscle, and your body, your lungs, and your brain. And more mitochondria means more energy in your brain cells, and your brain cells are highly active cells. They fire, the signals travel up to 260 miles an hour inside your brain cells. So to hear 260 miles an hour. That's speed. That requires such fine-tuning of all chemicals. You can't have too much potassium here, or too much amyloid here, or too much iron here. Everything needs to be fine-tuned. These are delicate systems, and everything needs to work properly. So you can't have just too much inflammation around. The milieu of the brain is a very beautiful, well-organized, well-oiled machine. You can't really have junk sitting around.
Yep.
So the pulsation of the heart needs to be right. The blood vessels in the brain cannot be rigid, because if they're rigid, they don't pulsate. If they don't pulsate, the stuff doesn't clear, doesn't cleanse. And you can't have junk in there. And you can't have inflammation in there. So you can't just have one drug that takes care of the cleansing of the brain and the blood flow and the tone of the blood vessels and the degree of omega-3 fatty acids in the brain. The omega-3 fatty acids are the good fats. And so the omega-3 fatty acids are important for the lining of the membranes of neurons. Think of a watermelon, and the thickness is for a cell, think of the watermelon, and the thickness is the cell membrane. That membrane has proteins that allow ions like potassium, chloride to go from one side to the other side. And those are highly regulated. Too much sodium goes in and the cell will fire away, and things would, fire away too much, and the neurons die because what's called excitotoxicity. And then little sodium going there, and the neuron doesn't have enough sodium to fire up those what's called action potentials, the signals that go 260 miles an hour. So the omega-3 fatty acids are important for the lining of these neurons and how well these proteins can function. If you don't have enough omega-3 fatty acids, these membranes don't have the right integrity and the right tone for these molecules, these proteins that work as channels to work. So omega-3 fatty acids are so important. And our average daily diet does not have enough omega-3 fatty acids, and that's the only vitamin I recommend. And I take it myself every day because I published a study in Nature showing that higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids are associated with a lower incidence of Alzheimer's disease. Not so much too many other vitamins. I'm definitely not in favor of multivitamins. I'm not in favor of these new things you see on television like Pervigen, because it's not clear how they exactly work, and there are no published trials to show they work. But omega-3 fatty acids, things like DHA and EPA, are really important for the brain, and I recommend a dose of 1,000 milligrams per day. It doesn't matter which brand, but you want to take omega-3 fatty acids, not fish oil. The fish oil has other things in it. You just want omega-3 fatty acid supplements, DHA and EPA. So the point is, you need to have exercise to increase blood flow to the brain. You want to have a diet that reduces inflammation in the brain, and you want to take omega-3 fatty acids to make sure that the membranes and the integrity of the neuron is maintained, and you need to just lower stress to reduce cortisol. If you do all of those things, you're maintaining your brain at an excellent condition so that those signals can go at 206 miles an hour. And if they don't, then they go at 2 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour. And that's why they may feel sluggish. You can't think of things. So those things, it's not like, boom, you were hit by a disease. It's not, boom, you had COVID. It's, boom, you have not taken care of multiple things. And there is no, boom, a treatment.
Right.
You need to be knowledgeable about these 4 different things that happen to the brain and how you need to address these things. And again, it's not complicated. You just have a system that stress is reserved for when something actually goes wrong. If you're stuck in traffic, that's not enough to get you angry. You should not be so wound up over minor things. You set a routine of exercising about 3 hours a week, whether you do 1.5 hours a week, or 6 times half an hour a week, or you just do one big thing on a weekend. As far as I'm concerned, you need to do 3 hours a week, and how you do it is up to you. Ideally, you should do it 3 times a routine, and then have a routine that you respect your sleep time. People should not think of sleep as a wasted time. Sleep is when your brain is rejuvenated. Sleep is when all this gunk is being cleared, your brain's cleansed. Sleep is when your memories are consolidated. Sleep is precious. And so if you have difficulty sleeping, you need to figure out why you're not sleeping. And a common problem is anxiety. So then you need to figure out what makes you anxious and realize, is this anxiety worth ruining your brain over it?
Mm.
Let's say you have conflicts with your spouse. Is the conflict with your spouse or your coworkers worth your brain getting damaged? I never forget this thing. I have two daughters, and one of them, Maya, when she was 6 years old, 7 years old, she just started school and she was supposed to read a book. And she comes to my lectures, and she has heard my lectures even back then. And I told her, honey, you're supposed to read this book by tomorrow. You haven't started it. And she said, Dad, stressing me out, and that's not good for my hippocampus. So I remind myself of that. If something gets me stressed out, I just realized, as my teenage daughters now say, it's not that deep. A lot of things are okay. Yeah. So track your sleep. You have to set exercise a routine, and don't eat junk food. Junk food, okay, you can have a little bit of French fries, okay, fine, but don't make hamburger, French fries, poorly prepared pizza, just a regular diet. You go for salad, go for things you find at farmer's market. Avoid getting things from bags and packs and cans and things that you get from fresh market, and make that a habit. And once you have that as a habit, then you don't even have to think about it. Like in our household, there's no junk food. We have healthy food every day. It's not a matter of thinking anymore. Like we don't eat junk food, and it doesn't even cross our mind to buy them. Just don't do that. And that's, I think, how we helped our patients, because when they came to our office twice a week for 12 weeks, not only they get brain training and they learn how to exercise, they receive a lot of education about what affects the brain and how those things affect the brain. And many of them, they had aha moment. And when they realize that stress brain, when you realize lack of exercise, dulls their brain, they change their lifestyle choices. And I think they will be like that for the rest of their life. And I think that's the contribution we made. And there are studies that have shown that, for example, people who exercise more, people who meditate on a regular basis have lower risk of cognitive impairment 20, 30, 40 years later. And our study, and that was also shown in that Cache County study that we had done back in 2003, 2004, that long term, you do see a lower risk of cognitive impairment. And in European countries, several European countries have shown that incidence of Alzheimer's has gone down since people's education and understanding of what causes memory loss has improved. So if the population is aging and there are more people who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, so you expect that there will be more cases of Alzheimer's disease. Makes sense, because the more people go to their 80s, the more people reach their 80s, the more people will be likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. And so it only makes sense that you'll have, in any given year, you will have more cases. And it turns out that the incidence of Alzheimer's is actually declining in many European countries. And it makes sense. Again, I was in Amsterdam in July, and I can see all these people in their 70s, 80s biking around. They're looking good. They're happy. And this is not the usual vision of someone in their 80s. Usually think of an 80s as someone who's older, sits around, watches TV, sits by the pool, plays cards with friends, and that's it. You don't think of them as being active members of the community, biking around, hiking, and living life to the fullest. I think, if you do incorporate those things that we know are so incredibly important for your brain, you have decades to benefit from them. if let's say your 40s and 50s and you say, I'm going to change the way I live, and it takes you 4 months to change your habits. But once those things become habits, then you have 40, 50 years to benefit from them.
Yeah. No, it's an important, a very important set of messages there. But yeah, it's never too late to get started. And I think, again, what you outlined here is such an elegant, multidisciplinary approach, and just, yeah, it's very inspiring, again, in this era where we're constantly told about this silver tsunami and just all the issues that are headed our way with these different brain problems. And it's an amazing model. Before I let you go, anything coming up that we should know about for 2023 as we get into 2024, whether it's per NeuroGrow Brain Fitness, per your teaching at Hopkins, at Harvard, anything conference-wise where we could run into you, meet you, listen to you, talk about these concepts as well? Anything I missed, please take the floor.
Yeah, I think that the most exciting recent development is how our genes are malleable. Yeah. People that, I have a gene for Alzheimer's disease, or I have a gene, my parents were not that smart, and I'm not like to be smart. And, I always talk about how your brain has a high degree of malleability. And what's new and exciting is that our genes are also not quite fixed. That there's a concept called epigenetics, which means that lifestyle actually affects your genes, and those genetic modifications are passed on to the next generation. So if you have twin brothers and have them raised in different environments, and look at them in their 50s and 60s, one of them may have become obese and have diabetes, and is high risk of actually dying early because of all these things. And the other one could be an athlete, could be accomplished musician, scientist, chef. And the thing that's interesting is that even though they're identical twins, when they have kids, their kids are going to be more like their fathers, not like their grandparents. The cousins are going to be more like their own fathers, even though they started with the same exact genes. When you do have different environments, let's say, you eat poor diet all the time, or you don't have enough sleep, there are some things that happen to the gene called methylation. The little tags that are added to protein because of your lifestyle. And those little molecular tags stick with the DNA, and then it gets transferred to the offspring. And that, to me, is amazing, that your genes don't code for you. Right. The genes are sort of principal overall pattern of how tall you are, what color eyes you have, what your personality is. I don't think it can change people's personality that much. I think that's as robust as their color eyes or their height. But the kind of person that you are is very much dependent on your childhood experiences, on adolescent experiences, what you did in college, who you marry, what kind of lifestyle you have. And that, to me, is amazing, that just like your brain has a lot of malleability, your genes have a lot of malleability. And what's really exciting is that recent studies have shown that lifestyle modifications can reverse that methylation. Yep. The methylation, which is epigenetic way of changing the codes in the brain, can be modified and can be reversed. And the thing that blows my mind away is this. When you do things that are good for you, the hippocampus grows. We know that. We've established that over and over again. And we've learned that things that can increase epigenetics in a good way include things like diet, exercise, meditation, stress reduction, good sleep. And some studies have shown that when you do these things, the degree of improvement in brain functions parallels the degree of improvement in your genetic makeup. In parallel. It's amazing. In parallel. So better brain and better genes seem to happen in exact correlation to each other, which means that like a universal principle that the things that are good for your genes are the same things that are good for your brain. And on a practical matter, this means that if you do those things, you will reach your 80s and 90s. And when you reach your 80s and 90s, your brain is good. You'll be sharp in your 80s and 90s. That to me is an amazing discovery, that not only you live longer, but you'll be sharp in your late life. And that to me is just a really good deal. And these are kind of things that help me live the kind of life I live. You know, I do my best to exercise at least 3 hours a week. I do a triathlon. I definitely make sleep a priority. I do things I enjoy. I do socialize. I do take my omega-3 fatty acids. I do avoid junk food. And that's it. You know, I don't have to buy anything expensive. Everything I talk about is readily available. I don't do anything that requires, you know, $100,000 a year infusions.
Right.
You know, and I think if you take the people who went to and got these $100,000 a year anti-amyloid drugs and spent $5,000 a year in coaching those same participants, you will see a lot better results than the modest reduction in the severity of symptoms. And that is what I find just amazing. And I'm not just saying that. If you put studies side by side in terms of outcome measures, the outcome measures for exercise alone is better than those drugs. And that's one thing you don't hear in the media. You don't hear, you know, it's called effect size. How much improvement have with this intervention versus this intervention? Yes, there was 64% reduction. But, you know, if something is, let's say you have a 2% chance of developing Alzheimer's disease in your 80s, and now reduced by 60%, or, you know, it's not 1%. Right. But the size is that small. It's not like suddenly you're sharp. Right. And the effect size, the degree of effectiveness of the interventions like diet, exercise, sleep, stress reduction is far beyond those anti-amyloid drugs. And that's one thing you don't hear in the news.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's especially the epigenetic message is one that, you know, I've also been really keen and fascinated by. And again, you know, that from everything I read about epigenetics, you were just pointing out all these things, whether it's exercise, the omega fatty acids, the sleep, they all have their tentacles into beneficial epigenetic changes. So you're obviously, you know, clearly in the right spot versus, you know, again, the single magic bullet thinking here. And it's so impressive. I wish you and your team there the best with all of this as you continue to grow the programs and get these concepts out there, because it's clearly what we need, especially in this amazing basket of unmet medical conditions. And again, for everybody who's going to be listening to this particular episode of our show across the various podcast networks or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to the amazing Dr. Majid Fotuhi, Medical Director, NeuroGrow Brain Fitness Center, affiliate staff, Johns Hopkins Medicine, Harvard Medical School. Dr. Fatui, I again want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us for a while about all these topics. It's really so impressive. Obviously, thank you for everything you do. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for so many people out there via what you do. It's a really, really inspiring story. And again, wishing you the best with all of this as you continue to get the message out there.
Thank you very much. I do have a website, drfatui.com, and I do have YouTube channel, and I started doing TikToks, and I'm doing some Instagram. I think it's important for me to spread this message. I have just started doing these things, so people can contact me through those podcasts and through those venues as well.
We will put all those links in the bio of the show as well. So everyone listening and watching will be able to make contact with Dr. Fatui and through all these different channels. And yeah, really, really great. So it was great having you on the show.
All right. Well, thank you for doing your homework and reading about what I've done. And I really enjoyed this. Usually people interview me are not so knowledgeable. And the fact that you knew what I was talking about actually helped. I really appreciate that.
I appreciate that too.